Okay, so this is the second part of our discussion in chapter 13, which is the upward sloping aggregate supply curve and the Phillips curve. Now we have already derived basically the upward sloping supply curve, which we will show as this. Okay, y is basically equal to its long run value unless price is different from the expected price. If price is higher than the expected price, then there is a supply response, and if it's less, there is a supply response also, but a negative one. Output goes down. All right, and then we discussed the adjustment now to the long run. We're moving from A to B in the short run, but from B to C in the long run, where expectations of the average price level change, and you have the new equilibrium where the actual equals the expected at y equals y bar, and that's point C. So now we're at the Phillips curve, right? So there is this idea that the higher output means lower unemployment, and that's accompanied by a higher price level given the previous year's price level, and that means higher inflation. So there's this idea that the aggregate supply curve is also this reflection of the fact that if you want more output or less unemployment, then you have to suffer through a higher price level. Okay. You can turn that, instead of thinking about it in terms of price levels, you can think about it in terms of changes in inflation, right? And when you are here thinking about it in terms of inflation, you are now calling it the aggregate supply as the Phillips curve. So the Phillips curve is just a reflection of this short run aggregate supply, where instead of focusing on the price level, you are thinking about inflation. So here's the Phillips curve that we're about to think about. Here's inflation, which is the dependent variable. And it's a function of three things: expected inflation. Notice that this basically also has the same role as expected price level, price versus expected price level. This one is the difference or the gap between the unemployment rate and the so-called natural unemployment rate. And this gap basically is the cyclical unemployment component of business cycles. And the beta here is the reaction or the effect on inflation of changes in the cyclical employment. And then finally, you have V, which is the supply shock, which is everything else that is not demand driven, because this changes in unemployment here is brought about through changes in aggregate demand, shifts in aggregate demand, change output, and therefore change unemployment relative to the natural rate. Okay. So you can think of this as shifts in the aggregate demand curve. Everything else that's not shifts in aggregate demand curve will affect inflation through this catch-all variable supply shock, nu V, or you can say it's V in ingredients. Where does this equation for the Phillips curve comes from? It comes from the aggregate supply function. So you have this as the aggregate supply function. It's just the inverse of the other aggregate supply function, where y is a function of p and expected price. And what you'll do is that you'll just subtract from one side the past levels price, and you'll subtract the same on the right hand side. Okay, so notice that this is unaffected here. This one can be considered as the inflation rate, especially when the p's here are like logs. So the changes in logs is the approximation of that is the percentage change, and that's why we are able to interpret this as an inflation rate. This one is the change in it's also the inflation rate, but it's the expected change in the inflation rate. And this remains to be that output gap, that y minus y bar, right? And you can think of this as, again, changes in aggregate demand and how that affects the price level, and in this case, inflation. And then your nu, or your V, this is your aggregate supply shock. And you're ending up with this one. Pi is a function of expected inflation plus the change in output relative to the natural level plus the supply shock. You can go from this change in y to y bar to its relationship with unemployment, because the higher the output is relative to y bar, the lower the unemployment is. And that's why there's a negative relationship between y minus y bar and u minus u natural. So the y bar is the natural rate of output, and then n is the natural rate of unemployment. Basically, the natural rate of unemployment is associated with the same y bar. It's the unemployment that's associated with this y bar. It may not be zero. It may be some small but appreciable amount. And that's why you can turn this term here, you can transform this term here into something relating to unemployment. And this is the traditional Phillips curve, where you have a relationship between the inflation rate and this gap between the unemployment rate and the natural rate of unemployment. So this is a cyclical unemployment, or shocks from aggregate demand. All right, so it's the same idea as the aggregate supply function, yeah? Because both equations show a link between real, and by real we mean the output, right? And or the gap between y and y bar, that causes the classical dichotomy to break down in the short run. So in the short run, aggregate supply output is related to changes in the price level. That's unexpected. That's different. That changes P from the expected price. According to the Phillips curve, unemployment is related to unexpected movements in the inflation rate. The aggregate supply curve is more convenient when you're studying the price level, whereas the Phillips curve is more convenient when you're thinking about unemployment and inflation. So now we think about what the expected inflation rate is. So how is that formed, right? How are the expectations of inflation formed? So that can actually be a complex question, as we've already discussed. The expectations formation is a key part of moving from the short run to the long run. But given the short run nature of the Phillips curve and the short run nature of the short run aggregate supply curve, which has that upward slope, we will have that the expected inflation is at least in the short run, approximately equal to last period's inflation. So you can write the Phillips curve as the following: pi equals last period minus this aggregate cyclical unemployment slash shocks to aggregate demand term, which has a negative slope inversely related to inflation, and then supply shock. All right. When written in this term, this is very crucial. The natural rate of unemployment is sometimes called the non-accelerating rate of unemployment. So it's called non-accelerating because if you take a look at these terms here, if you move this term, which is the expected inflation or last period's inflation, to the left-hand side, now you will have pi minus 1, right? Or the change in inflation. So the change in the change is called acceleration, right? If you remember back to your physics days in high school. So what we're saying here is that the change in the inflation rate is 0. So pi is equal to pi last period when u equals the natural rate of unemployment. So that's why it's called the non-accelerating inflation rate. Whenever U is greater than UN, then that requires an accelerating inflation rate, the pi inflation, which itself is the growth rate of the price level, is also by itself accelerating or growing. Okay. So that's why it's called the Nye rule. All right, so now you've got the Phillips curve, and the Phillips curve captures those two factors in inflation. The second term here shows you cyclical unemployment, which comes from a demand pull inflation or changes in inflation due to an increase in output due to an increase in demand, aggregate demand. The next term is V, or nu, shows how inflation rises or falls because of supply shocks. So when V is positive, that's an adverse supply shock, if you recall back from the previous video. And an adverse supply shock would tend to increase inflation. And that's called the cost push inflation, as opposed to the demand pull inflation from the other term. Okay, so now we get to one of the key ideas for the Phillips curve, which is the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So the Phillips curve, it should be clear that there is this negative inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation, given some value for UN. So let's look at figure 13-4. So here you have the value of UN, and when U is equal to UN, then the value of the Phillips curve itself, or inflation, is equal to expected inflation plus the supply shock. However, when U, for example, is greater than UN, then you will experience higher inflation relative to expected inflation. And if unemployment, actually this is lower, I should say. When unemployment is lower, then inflation is higher. When unemployment is higher, right? And remember that a high unemployment means slack in the economy, slower or lower GDP or output. Then that means you have a lower inflation, right? Lower than expected inflation plus nu, or the supply shock. So this line here reflects this short-run trade-off. We note that the position of the short-run Phillips curve depends on the rate of inflation, right? So, sorry, not the rate, expected rate of inflation. So it depends on this term, E pi. So when E pi goes down, the whole line shifts down, and when E pi goes up, the whole line shifts up. So the slope of the line won't change, right? However, it really, the magnitude of the trade-off here will change because you're moving from, say, like 1% to 3% inflation versus here you're moving from like 4 to 6% inflation, right? Proportionally speaking. So that's why there's a shift in the short-run trade-off when it comes to a high expected inflation, which is here, and a low expected inflation, which is here. And you can see that mathematically here in the Phillips curve. I can just find the Phillips curve again. But that's the special version here. This is the Phillips curve. As you can see, the intercept really is a factor of this one, right? That if you have a high expected inflation, then that curve, that downward sloping curve in pi and u space will be higher if this is higher, right? And same thing, of course, with this supply shock. And the supply shock basically shifts the Phillips curve or the aggregate supply curve up or down if it's a good or lower a good cost shock. All right, so let's go back. All right, and that relates to the sacrifice ratio. So here, they call the book asks a question. So imagine inflation rate at 6%, and employment is at its natural rate, what would happen to unemployment, okay, and output if the central bank pursued a policy to reduce inflation from 6% to 2%? So you can see here that it's asking the question, if this is 6%, how, and we're moving down along this line and moving from 6% to say 2%. What is the change in unemployment that will result from that, right? How much unemployment are you going to generate if you want inflation to go down from 6% to a lower amount, 2%? And remember, if unemployment goes up, then output will go down. Okay, so where were we? The Phillips curve shows that in the absence of a beneficial supply shock, that is a shifting down of the Phillips curve, lowering inflation requires a period of high unemployment and reduced output. Okay, so you have to move down the Phillips curve. But for how much and how long, and that is basically a function of that slope, right? So the answer to that question can be summarized in a number called the sacrifice ratio. And the sacrifice ratio is the percentage of a year's GDP that must be forgone to reduce inflation by 1 percentage point. Or you can think about it in terms of unemployment also. And that how much unemployment, a change of X% or 1% in unemployment will translate to a change of 2 points, we can also express the sacrifice ratio in terms of unemployment, because this Okun's law, which relates unemployment to output, says that in terms of sacrificing, say, a year's worth of real GDP, this represents a given amount of unemployment for the year because of the relationship between unemployment and output. So you can see here, for example, that the sacrifice ratio is a positive number. So a typical estimate, at least in the United States, according to the literature here, typical estimate is about 5. That means for inflation to fall by 1 percentage point, you expect a 5% fall of 1 year's GDP in exchange. So this is the cost, that's the sacrifice to gain lower inflation. So this inflation could take various forms, each totaling the same sacrifice of, say, 20% of a year's GDP in this particular example. So, for example, a rapid disinflation would lower output by 10% per 2 years. And this is sometimes called the cold turkey solution. So a very quick disinflation. So a moderate disinflation would lower output by 5% for 4 years. Take note that's 5 times 4 is still equal to 20, because you require, in this example, 20% a year of GDP. So you can spread that out over multiple years, or you can do it as quickly as possible. Of course, a drop of 20% in of a year's GDP is quite disastrous. So you wouldn't want to do this entirely for 1 year. Next. So rational expectations and the possibility of painless disinflation. So recall that we talked about the sacrifice ratio, about how lowering the inflation rate or disinflation will necessitate a sacrifice in terms of lost GDP or additional unemployment. So an alternative approach is to assume that people have rational expectations, that they optimally use all available information. And what this is saying is that it's possible that even in the short run, under the theory of rational expectations, and here I'm just going to highlight the term rational expectations. that people might optimally use all available information, and this would allow them to update their expected inflation, right? And recall that if you update your expected inflation based on the Phillips curve, let's go back. Here, let's use this. Here, that if some of the adjustment would happen through here, then it need not happen through here, right? So if for instance, expected inflation, how would you lower inflation, right? You would lower inflation either through higher unemployment in this case, right? That's the sacrifice ratio, or you may be able to lower current inflation by lowering the expectations of inflation. And if you're able to lower this, then you don't need to sacrifice much or perhaps anything at all if you're able to reach your target inflation rate simply through changes in the expected inflation rate. If you're able to change the inflation rate simply through changes in the expected component of inflation, expected change. Now let's go back. Okay, so that is the rational expectations idea, right? Which will mean that you're able to change the expected inflation rate, and you don't need to basically sacrifice or pay for a lower inflation rate or disinflation through higher unemployment or lower output. Okay. Here's the kicker, the key idea. If people form their expectations rationally, then inflation may have less inertia than it first appears. So this is Thomas Sargent describing its implications for the Phillips curve. Rational expectations view denies there's inherent momentum to the process of inflation. So this view maintains that if firms and workers now have come to expect high rates of inflation in the future, and that they strike inflationary bargains in light of these expectations. However, it is held that people expect high rates of inflation in the future precisely because the government's current and prospective monetary fiscal policies warrant those expectations. Thus, inflation only seems to have momentum of its own. It's actually the long-term government policy of persistently running large deficits and creating money, which imparts the momentum to the inflation rate. So this is saying that government policy is not just affecting current inflation, but it's also affecting future or expected inflation. And that's what's sort of supporting that increase in current inflation today. All right, so one of the key ideas here is that the short-run Phillips curve, then, if rational expectations are correct, they don't accurately represent the options that policymakers have available. So if policymakers are credibly committed to reducing inflation, rational people will understand this commitment and quickly lower their expectations of inflation. So this is the other way to lower current inflation, which is to affect your expectations in the future by doing actions which influence that future or that expectation of future inflation. In an extreme case, in the most extreme case, you can imagine that reducing the rate of inflation in this way will not cause any recession or lowered output or increased unemployment at all. So this has two requirements. First, it must be announced, okay, before wages and prices have formed their expectations. Second, firms and workers must believe the announcement. If both requirements are met, then the announcement will immediately shift the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. That means it will affect that expected inflation, and it will lower that expected inflation and allow for a lower rate of inflation without higher unemployment. All right. Now, our final topic here in this chapter sort of is a contra view towards the natural rate, right? So the natural rate of output, the natural rate of unemployment, that's considered long-run ideas, right? and that they're affected by technology, by factors of production, the production function, and whatnot, right? Ultimately, short-run changes in aggregate demand will change that gap between U and U bar or Y and Y bar, right? But the Y bar and the U bar are unaffected. Okay, so that's called the natural rate hypothesis. Fluctuations in aggregate demand affect output and employment only in the short run. In the long run, Y bar is still there, and you return to Y bar, U bar is still there, and you return to U bar. And it's described by these fundamental factors. However, hysteresis says, right, that there may be long-running influence of history on the natural rate. So the natural rate is not just determined by these fundamental factors, but they're also determined by history and how aggregate demand has been working on the economy. That changes in output and employment through aggregate demand can change even the long run long run level of output and the long run level of unemployment. So a recession can have these permanent effects or change the natural level of output and natural level of unemployment. If it changes, for example, the people who become unemployed, for instance, workers might lose a valuable job skills, right? That's resonant in current discussions about post-COVID recovery, and that you have higher, you have this learning loss debate in Philippine education post-COVID, post-quarantine. Another way in which a recession can permanently affect the economy is by changing the process that determines wages. Those who become unemployed may lose their influence on the wage-setting process. More generally, some of the insiders in the wage-setting process become outsiders. If the smaller group of insiders cares more about high real wages and less about high unemployment, then the recession may permanently push real wages farther above the equilibrium level and raise unemployment structurally. Okay, so that's one idea. Ultimately, the point of this hysteresis concept is that the short-run changes in aggregate demand may affect not just the cyclical component or the gap between Y and Y bar and the gap between U and U bar, but it can have this permanent effect through changes in the long-run values of employment and output. Okay. So hysteresis remains a controversial theory. Economists believe that the theory can explain the persistently high unemployment in Europe, for example. But at any rate, that's something that the people should be considering when it comes to estimating this Phillips curve. Trying to understand this relationship as it applies to the actual economy, including the Philippine economy. So after this video, in a face-to-face class, we'll be talking a little bit about the research that brings some of these ideas to the Philippines. We have learned, for instance, that the sticky price model relies on some firms being unable or don't want to change their price. We have some research on that. We have research on the Phillips curve in the Philippines. We have research on the sacrifice ratio as well, and so on. We can also discuss some of the limitations of the current research. And maybe if you were interested in learning more macro, you can actually contribute to some of these discussions. As you can see, this is actually some of the most important and controversial parts of macroeconomics, in that changes in aggregate demand, that's something that we sort of understand, even if the size of the fiscal multiplier is still a research question. It's still the change in aggregate demand is relatively more understood or understandable. It's really the shape and the slope of the aggregate supply, which can be quite complex because it deals with something called expectations in the future, and it has to involve some kind of market imperfection, right? That forces some firms, for instance, to change their output level in response to a change in the price level or a change in inflation, right? Or to have that short run slope in the aggregate supply curve. Okay, so we'll continue with our discussion in class next week. Bye-bye.